Welcome to the New America Foundation. We have some seats up front for folks in the back. My name is David Gray, and on behalf of Justin King and our whole Workforce and Family program, I would like to invite you and thank you for joining us today for our release of the International Comparisons of the Foundation for Child Development's 2007 Child Wellbeing Index. I know that this week children throughout America have their eyes fixated abroad at the UK for the release of the latest and final Harry Potter book. And I think there's a lot that we adults can look and learn from fixating our eyes across the seas and seeing what our other countries are doing that can help children. And that's why we're here today. So my hope is from our presentations and our respondents and from your question and our discussion, we might gain some insights into what our nation can learn from what our friends abroad are doing to help the next generation. We have been very pleased to partner in this work with a great leader in this field, the Foundation for Child Development. And we appreciate their support of this initiative. Today is the second in a series of quarterly events that we've been hosting to look at the well-being of American children. In April, we had the release of the 2007 Child Wellbeing Index here. The Foundation for Child Development's Child Wellbeing Index is a research-based report that Dr. Kenneth Land from Duke University puts together that looks at the status of the U.S. children historically and today in terms of our international comparisons. And this is a follow-up study to our April release that looks at the well-being of our kids compared to similar countries. We're pleased to partner with Dr. Land, who develops the CWI, and in a few moments he will explain the results of the international comparisons. Then, as I mentioned, we have a distinguished panel of respondents, and we have a lot of knowledge in this room, which we hope to take advantage of through a lively discussion-answer period. But first, I'd like to introduce Ruby Takanishi, the President of the Foundation for Child Development, to begin our program. Prior to her current position, Dr. Takanishi was Assistant Director of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education in the President's Office of Science and Technology Policy. She spent 10 years as Executive Director of the Carnegie Council of Adolescent Development, was Executive Director of the Foundation of Behavioral, Psychological, and Cognitive Sciences. She's been a faculty member at UCLA, the Teachers College at Columbia University, and Yale University, to name but three, and has received numerous awards for her work on behalf of America's children. So, Ruby?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Before I introduce Kenneth Land of Duke University, who is the developer of the FCD Index of Child Wellbeing, I want to just say a few words about why the Foundation for Child Development invests in Ken's research. Under the leadership of one of my predecessors, presidents of the foundation, Bert Brim, who's still around today. He was the former president of the Social Science Research Council and the Russell Sage Foundation. And about 30 years ago, under his leadership at the Foundation for Child Development, he started to seed what is now known as the Childhood Social Indicators movement, which has gained quite a bit of momentum. There was the first international meeting, society meeting on childhood social indicators this summer in Chicago. And the goal of this movement from the beginning is to answer the question, how well are children doing? How do we know? And most importantly, how can we contribute to policies and practices that support their optimal development? Our own goal at the Foundation is to use the CWI as a platform and release events like this one and the one that David mentioned earlier this year to draw attention to policymakers as well as the public to the status of America's children, to be a starting point, just a starting point for deeper conversations and debates about how we can improve children's well-being in the United States. And as the April 17th, 2007 release of the CWI indicated, there is a lot of room for improvement in the status of children in the United States. And I think Ken Land will describe how big that challenge is. We can and we should do much more than we are doing today to support America's children and their families. So today's event, as David noted, is to compare how well American children are doing in comparison to a number of other English-speaking nations. And I see again this Ken's report to come, as a way to stimulate a continuing dialogue in our country today about the roles of individuals and families, roughly the private sector, and the roles of and responsibilities of government, the public sector, for raising the next generation. Over the last 30 years, there's been a shift, I think, that we all recognize, from the public sector to individuals and families, smaller government, the end of big government, state policies that unevenly invest in children, which is the work of Janet Gornick and Marcia Myers. And that shift needs rebalancing in today's social and economic context. So I see Ken's findings as an opportunity for what I hope will be many more conversations that lead to the renegotiation of a social covenant that some call a social contract or a compact, between individual and family responsibility and social responsibility, namely government and civil society, for shaping the life prospects of all children. I believe that we must find a better way of balancing individual, family, and social responsibility for future generations in the American context. And this comparative perspective provides us with an opportunity to ask questions about why we see differences between these countries, which share some common historical, philosophical, and political origins. Do policies matter? What policies matter? What roles should parents and families and civil society as well as government play? So I'm really pleased to introduce Ken Land of Duke University, who is a leader in international authority on social indicators, who will share his findings, and I look forward to a spirited debate about reconstructing a new American social covenant among families, community, and government. Thank you.
Good morning, David. Do you want to bring this up? Do you know how the machine moves? Start the slideshow.
Yeah, that one on the bottom one. Okay.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that cool?
So just each time.
It's not the show yet. It's going to start the show.
You?
Pardon me?
Which do you want?
I'm sorry, which one?
You
I'll have to start the show. Great. Okay, I'll have to remember not to have a heavy hand here because I know this will go very rapidly through the slides if I'm not careful. We have the research team at Duke, Dr. Vicki Lamb, who a very important part of the project, could not be here today, but I'll try to work through this presentation. And let me get started. Basic social indicators questions. How are we doing? That's what social indicators are all about, trying to measure what our status is and how we're doing. And more specifically with respect to children, how are the kids doing, including adolescents and teenagers and young folks. So how are we doing, and in particular, how are our kids doing? These questions can be addressed by comparisons. One sort of comparison can be to goals or other externally established standards. In the U.S., these goals, for example, the periodic commission reports Healthy People 2000, now Healthy People 2010, and I'm sure in a few years Healthy People 2020 establishes certain goals and standards, and we can measure how are we doing with respect to those standards. We can measure how are we doing with respect to past historical values, and of course the CWI, the Child and Youth Wellbeing Index, very much is focused on that. And we can also address the question with respect to comparisons to other contemporaneous units. We can compare among subpopulations within the U.S. We can compare states within the U.S., regions. within the U.S. or international regions, and we can compare among countries. The CWI uses all 3 points of comparison. Our annual reports show the following sorts of things. I'm not going to dwell upon this, but here's the CWI. We reported in April across the last 30 years, showing an oscillating period initially, a long period of decline, followed by a period of recovery, and most recently we were the first to call attention to this stagnation period since the year 2000, and as we were the first to say that this trend in the mid to late 90s was not just a trend in specific indicators, but an overall trend of improvements in child well-being. The question remains, however, how well are America's children doing in recent years as compared to children and youth of other nations? So we address this question in this report. We compare trends in child and youth well-being to those of 4 other English-speaking countries. In particular, we have comparisons to Australia, to Canada, to New Zealand, and the UK. And these nations were chosen for a number of reasons. We all share a common language, presumably at least. Of course, with enormous differences in dialects, and to the point that often we can't understand each other. But at least in terms of the dictionary, we share a common language. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the U.S. are former colonies of the U.K. All 5 nations are liberal democracies that have representative democratic forms of government. All 5 also share a considerable emphasis on the use of economic markets for production and distribution of goods and services. And because of all the above, we share, to some extent, common elements of culture. So we focus on these 5 Anglophone nations. We assembled data on 19 key international indicators of child and youth well-being that were measured circa the year 2000. Of course, statistics tend to lag, and so we would like to update those, and we will eventually, but for purposes of this report, we looked around the year 2000. The 19 key indicators were classified into the 7 domains of well-being that we use to construct the Child and Youth Well-Being Index, the CWI. These include economic well-being, social relationships, health, safety and behavior, educational attainments, community connectedness, that's participation in social institutions, which for children tends to be education, and later in the teen years some connection to economic institutions, and emotional well-being. Now, I would dearly love, if I were in Duke in the classroom, we would go through all 19 indicators slide by slide, and we do have those on another PowerPoint presentation if you're interested in them, but of course they're in the written report that you have copies of, many of them at least. And I was told by David and by Harold Leibowitz that if I did that, I would get the hook and they would take me off the stage. So what I'm going to do is just go to the bottom line, just sort of the summary tables that present report cards that compare across the indicators and domains. And I'm going to look at Table 1 first. In Table 1, we use the following notation. We use B's and W's. The B's indicate that the rates in the key indicators and domains of well-being are better for the U.S. than for the comparison countries. The W's indicate that they're worse, and an equal sign indicates they're roughly equal. And so a blank cell indicates no country indicator data was available. And there is Table 1, if you can read it a ways back into the room, and it's in the report as well. And we found Table 1 fascinating because you see that there are regions, domains of well-being where we're kind of split. In particular, for family economic well-being, the U.S. is more successful than the comparison Anglophone countries in having kids in households with at least one adult employed in the labor force. But We are far less successful in having kids in households that are above the poverty line. On the other hand, here in this region, in the health indicators, you see a lot of W's, where the U.S. is tending to not do as well as the comparison countries. By contrast, in this domain of well-being, risky behaviors in adolescence and teenage years, we tend to do better. Again, down here in educational attainment, everyone knows our test scores tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum. And then down here in this domain of well-being, connections to social institutions, we also see a lot of B's. And the single indicator we have of emotional well-being, suicide rates, the U.S. does better than 4 of the other Anglophone countries. So you see regions in the table in which you see more B's than W's, and regions that you see more W's than B's, and some in which the W's and B's are kind of split. So I'm going to go on to Table 2 for an additional comparison. Table 2 presents a different perspective. This is a summary of relative rankings of the 5 Anglophone countries based on each of the 7 child and youth well-being domains and indicators. And these domain-specific rankings are based on the averages of the rankings of the indicators within each domain. And they range from 1, which is the highest ranking on child well-being of the 5 Anglophone countries, down to 5 or 4 if data are not available on all the indicators. And there are 2 composite rankings at the bottom of the table. One is the average rank across the 7 domains of well-being, and the second is the average rank across the 19 indicators, just using the indicators directly themselves and averaging their ranks. And there's Table 2. And again, you get a sense that you have a mixed picture. There are some domains of well-being in which the U.S. is doing better, and some in which it's doing a lot worse. And if you look at the average ranks, you'll see that the U.S. is sort of in the middle of the pack, with Canada and Australia tending to have better average rankings, and New Zealand and the UK lower average rankings. And I will point out here that of these 5 countries, the U.S. is, of course, by far the largest, with a population approaching 300 million. The UK at about 61 million comes in second. Canada at about 32 million third. Australia at about 20 million, and then New Zealand at about 4 million. So there's wide diversity here in the sizes of these nations. And I think the good news here is that while many of us may approach this comparison with trepidation and say that, with this huge, diverse nation that we have here in the U.S., it's going to be impossible for us to do well compared to these Anglophone countries. So I think the good news is that, in fact, it's a mixed picture, that there's some areas in which we do pretty well and some in which we don't. On the other hand, there's lots of room for doing better than we're doing. So overall conclusions, I will simply say that although no country outscores the U.S. on all domains of child and youth well-being, our comparisons show deficiencies in the U.S., particularly in the family economic well-being, health, and educational attainment domains. On the other hand, the U.S. does relatively well with respect to the risky behavior, the safety behavior indicators, connectedness to social institutions, and emotional well-being domains. The analysis of the average rankings shows that the U.S. falls roughly in the middle of the group of 5 Anglophone nations. And so again, the overall conclusion is that the picture is mixed, and I think I look forward to the discussion by the other presenters this morning, and I think we can have a fascinating discussion of what's going on and why the comparison come out the way they do. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Ken, thank you very much for that important presentation. Just two things. One, as you know, the report is available, as most of you have seen, on that table outside. It's also available on the Foundation for Child Development's website, New America's website, and as Ken has indicated, on the Duke website to provide some more context and information. Ken's right, I didn't let him do the full 19 slides, but the upside of keeping the presentation straight out short is we have a few moments for questions just briefly, if Ken wouldn't mind, just on what he's said to date on the methodology and the basic report, knowing that you're going to have some respondents in just a moment who are going to dive down on some other areas. But are there questions for Ken at this point on what he's presented? Go ahead.
Yeah, Barbara Kungold with the Center for the Advancement of Health. And I just want to suggest what I'm sure you know well, which is that the averages mask some really lamentable, really unconscionable disparities among children. And with the Harvard School of Public Health, with Dolores Escobedo Garcia at the Harvard School of Public Health, we've recently set up diversitydata.org, a website looking at racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic inequalities in American cities. And we see that black and white children have almost no overlap. And when we look at health, income, and educational attainment, as you do, but also housing quality and affordability, and neighborhood poverty levels, and social isolation, schools and economic opportunity. And it just looks as if, despite, you've averaged, but that black and white children almost don't overlap on our charts, and Hispanic children have an educational, a health inheritance. They have higher health at birth than one might expect, but it erodes over time with lower incomes and poor neighborhoods and high poverty levels. So I just want to mention within those averages,
in our April
there's a lot of
report,
disparity.
in our April report, we did focus on some race and ethnic comparisons, and I agree with you entirely that this is a challenge for the future work on social indicators, is to do better work at diversity measures.
I think if I could, it's such an important point, and one thing that both the Foundation for Child Development and New America is very interested and concerned in. Ken obviously mentioned he is too, because he put it in the April report, but this is the second of a group of quarterly meetings, and as we focus on other meetings, the topic you raised is going to be one that we're very interested in seeing if we can make a contribution to. I'd love to chat about it. Any other questions at this point for Ken? Yes, sir.
Phil O'Hare from Casey Foundation. On the table one, is the W and the B statistically significantly worse or better?
No, Bill. There's no attempt to apply a statistical significance test here. The samples are too small. There are only 5 nations here for comparisons, and we thought that a qualitative picture was better than attempting to go to statistical precision at this point.
All right. We will have a chance to quiz Ken later on the report, but at this point I want to move on to the part where we have a chance to really look at some specifics and both in depth and breadth, and we have a great panel who we're very grateful could spend some of their time with us today to provide some of their knowledge with us today. Let me encourage the panel, invite them to come up, and we have Janet Gornick first, and she is a political economist on the faculty of the City University of New York. She's also director of the Luxembourg Income Study, a cross-national research institute and data archive based in Luxembourg. Most of her research is comparative across the industrialized countries and concerns social welfare policies and their impact on family well-being and gender equality. Professor Gornick has published many articles on the subject of work-family policies and balance, something I'm very interested in numerous academic journals, and her book, Families at Work, Policies for Reconciling Work and Family, was published in 2003. She serves on many advisory boards, including the Council on Contemporary Families, the Work and Family Legal Center, and the Journal of European Social Policy. Next, we'll have Doug Steiger, who's been a member of the Senate Democratic Policy Committee since 2005 and previously worked for the Senate Finance Committee in the Office of Management and Budget. In 2003-2004, Doug was an Atlantic Fellow where he spent 8 months in Scotland as a Presbyterian minister. I am very, very jealous of that, studying the impact of the UK's drive to end child poverty and writing the paper Eradicating Child Poverty in Scotland in the Era of Devolution. And then we have Adam Carasso, who's currently the research director of the Fiscal Policy Program here at New America. Adam's research on taxation, savings, inequality, children, and the budget process, as well as fiscal responsibility, has been featured widely in the news media and in printed press. Before joining New America, Adam worked at the Urban Institute and the Urban and Brookings Tax Policy Center, and his projects include the examination of children's share of the federal budget relative to other priorities he's worked on in the past, and also a project proposing various reforms of children's health benefits. There's more information on all the speakers in your handouts, but I wanted to provide a sketch here. We're very grateful they all could join us today. Janet, please begin.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at this really interesting event. What I'm going to do is to speak a little bit about the Anglophone countries, the countries chosen for this study, in a broader context by bringing in some European countries. I want to say I don't mean that. I want to say up front I don't suggest that a comparison among the English-speaking countries is not interesting and useful. I think that it is, and I think particularly for political purposes, many of us who've been working in this field for a long time understand that comparisons with countries perceived to be more similar often are received more favorably. But I think it's also important to note that these countries as a group tend to be laggards in terms of both child outcomes, but more importantly, work and family policy that has enormously important implications for parental well-being as well as child well-being. So my own area of work for about the last 20 years has focused on Northern and Western Europe, looking at the U.S. and Canada as well, and recently I've been looking at New Zealand. So I want to say that I'm moving a bit afield from the presentation that you've seen. So what I want to do today is two things. I hope most of you can see this. If not, I'll give you a bit of a report. I want to do two things, really, which is to present a very broad brushstroke of some indicators, a few actually, of what I would call parental well-being, and some indicators here of child well-being. They overlap some with what Dr. Land has shown you. And then I want to very quickly talk about three different areas of public policy where the U.S. really is quite different, and in fact where the Anglophone countries as a whole tend to be fairly different from the Northern and Western European countries. So what you see here is these are some figures that were in fact in my book. They also happen to be centered around the year 2000. I'm working on updating them. So the first three columns show various measures of something else I'm very interested in, which is parental time availability for children and also gender equality. So what I've done here is the top row, what you'll see are the 4 Nordic countries, countries that are very often studied in the work and family world: Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. 4 continental countries: Belgium, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Then there's a single row for the UK here and also a row for the US. So I'll say a little bit about the other English-speaking countries as I go along, especially in the policy area. Just to note a couple of things is that parents' well-being and child well-being are very intertwined. And there are a lot of different things that we could talk about here. Just to mention, though, that when we look at the U.S., the first 2 columns here show 2 measures of gender equality, actually, in terms of women's well-being. And the first column is in the paid labor market, and the second column has to do with gender differences in time spent in childcare and housework, which is unpaid work. So just a background, I know it's a bit afield from our interest here, but the U.S. is not doing especially well in terms of gender equality, which I think is something that's relatively surprising to a number of audiences. So we have a labor market in the U.S. and behavioral outcomes in which men and women's engagement in paid work and unpaid work is actually quite differentiated, and more so here than in a number of European countries. In the third column, it's something about parental work time, which I'm going to come back to in the next slide. I want to just say a few things about some of these indicators of child well-being. So again, I hope you can read this. In the next column is an indicator of child poverty, which happens to be the exact same measure just by chance. In Professor Land's report, it's data that's very commonly, an indicator that's very commonly used, which is a relative poverty rate. We can talk about the details later if anyone is interested. I classified these countries into poverty rates. Good, I called a poverty rate, a child poverty rate of less than 5%, 5 to 10% moderate, and 10% or more I called poor, a poor level of child poverty. All 5 of the Anglophone countries are poor. relative to are poor, meaning that they have high levels of child poverty relative to continental and northern Europe. I have spent a lot of time studying the origins of that. I think social policy is an enormous part of that story. I don't believe it's demography. Clearly, high levels of employment are also not countervailing that. I think it's important to note that poverty itself affects a lot of the other outcomes. I think you don't see this in this picture, but Canada and Australia, as you can see from Professor Land's report, actually do have slightly better levels of child poverty. The UK is a really crucial story, which you'll hear about. Infant mortality, the U.S. also coming up poorly. I won't give you, I have notes with me, and I can answer them if anybody's interested as to what the cutoffs are of poor, moderate, and high. I don't think it's a good use of our time at the moment. But infant mortality, as noted, the U.S. does poorly. The other four are all moderate as well. If we look at science scores, as were noted by Professor Land, this is, of course, a rather motley group of indicators. I was reaching for some indicators that I had that overlapped fairly closely with what he's done. U.S. also, we know, ranking poorly. The U.K., moderate. I didn't have comparable numbers on Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but if we look at the reading and math picture, as in the numbers that you have, they're all fairly similar to the U.S. as well. So the Anglophone countries, again, are not really doing impressively well relative to some of these other countries. Teen pregnancy, well, actually, television viewing, I don't know where that's coming from, television viewing is an interesting indicator, and one that I picked up mostly because I was interested in alternatives to babysitting, of which I'm afraid the television seems to be one of them. U.S. kids, this is an indicator of the frequency with which children watch 4 hours or more per day. U.S. children watch a lot of television. U.K. also moderate. I'm not terribly sure. The U.K. Yes, also came out moderate. Now, there are a number of explanations for this. I do think that the television is a substitute for parents' time, especially in the afternoon. I think also some have argued that there is actually more television to watch in the United States, so this may be a TV quality indicator. And as someone who's spent an enormous amount of time in Europe, I would have to say that is true. Teen pregnancy, we also know that U.S. outcomes are poor. My data here are pregnancy, not births, so they're not exactly comparable to what's in the report. UK results are moderate. The other three, I'm not exactly sure with the comparable indicators, but New Zealand is similar to the UK. Canada and Australia slightly more favorably. Someone has also suggested to me in seriousness that the kids, maybe they're actually not really watching television in the United States. There may be some relationship here between the TV and the teen pregnancy. Now, I just want to tell a very quick story. I know my time is limited. Much of my own work, I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, is actually on parental well-being. I've studied parents much more than children, but my book focused quite a bit on the interplay between these two spheres of well-being, which I think, with appropriate social policy package, should go hand in hand, and there shouldn't be a trade-off between parental well-being and child well-being. Something I think is really important to note in terms of, it's just one angle, it's one I'm convinced is a really important story in all of the countries, these English-speaking countries, and that is that we work very long hours. These numbers happen to be from 2000. I have the same picture with other countries at different points in time. These are annual hours. The U.S., Canada, and the U.K. can be seen in this picture. The U.K. were working very long hours, while annual hours have come down all across Europe, and even in Japan, the U.S. is now working longer hours than even the Japanese, who were famous for their long work hours. Canada, you can see, is close to the U.S., the U.K. Ranking slightly further down. Australia and New Zealand fall between the United States and Canada. The very long work hours are common among all workers, and I have lots of data to show that their parents are no exception to this story. Couples with two working parents that have children, in the United States, two-thirds of couples together are working jointly over 80 hours a week, and 16% over 100 hours a week. And again, as you mentioned, the distributional story, anytime you bring distributions in, and I apologize, I too am showing averages, the U.S. is off the map because the diversity is always so great here. So we have this very wide distribution. What's going on? Why are these work hours so long? There's lots of research on that, something I'm working on myself. I think that there are two important clues in this picture here. This is showing two very important elements of the regulation of working time. If you can see the picture here, in the shorter bar, it shows the number of mandated paid days off per year, and in the higher bar, it shows the weekly normal work hours, which is, for the most part, in law, it's the overtime threshold. So weekly work hours in the U.S., as you can see, the U.S. is on the far right here. We have a 40-hour work week unchanged for over 6 decades. In many of the European countries now, the work hour is now 35 to 39 hours a week. The days off per year, the U.S. is unusual and it's completely silent on a guarantee of paid days off per year. This is where the American work hours are very long, which is really, it's more in the days worked per year than the weekly work hours, although they're both long. The Anglophone countries as a group, these hours are all long, as I said, New Zealand and Australia as well. The New Zealanders, for example, they don't set a weekly work limit, but they have put in place a 15-hour paid days off law that went up to 15 days a year that went up to 20 in 2007. So the New Zealanders, and in Australia there's been a lot of discussion of working time, and also New Zealand is now, I just returned from New Zealand to look at this law, I'll come back to this in a moment, has passed a parental leave law and also is working on now a right to flexible work hours law. So I think the New Zealanders are sort of like the UK, or a little bit more in the UK sphere on some of the working time regulations. So working time is a very big part of the story. A lot of American kids are really lagging in time with their parents. And I think there's a lot of research that shows that American parents preserve their time. They cut sleep, they outsource everything that they can before they cut time with their children. But there's no question that we have a time deficit. And for a lot of families, there's both income poverty and time poverty, and that's a really crucial worry. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to move quickly. Another comparison that I think is very important in terms of public policy. This is a graph that is showing paid family leave across countries. It may be a little hard to see. The U.S. Not in a very impressive position in this international comparison. The United Kingdom actually has gone up slightly. I apologize, this picture's a little bit out of date. Canada has somewhat more generous law. What I'm looking at here, and paid family leave is very complicated, but what I'm looking at here are national laws that mandate the payment of pay either for mothers and or for fathers after birth and adoption. So in this particular graph, there are many ways to compare these countries. This shows you the number of weeks of fully paid leave, so it's the benefit level times the duration that would be available to a mother if she chose all of the leave to which she were available, if she took all of the leave for which she were available. Paid family leave, which I guess I would say, I'm happy to say, is sort of back on the policy agenda these days. This is a place where the United States is absolutely off the map. And up until 6 years ago, up until 2002, there were 6 countries on the entire globe that did not have a national law mandating some kind of paid maternity. And those countries were the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea. So the Anglophone countries, the rich Anglophone countries, have really staked out an unusual trajectory here. Australia has 1 year of unpaid leave, and it does have a birth grant. And in 2002, New Zealand left that group of 6 behind. It's now a group of 5, and New Zealand has paid parental leave. 100% pay replacement up to a ceiling. It is a low ceiling for 12 weeks, which in European terms is not terribly long, but it's an extraordinarily interesting model for the Family and Medical Leave Act, the possible addition of wage replacement. And the political landscape in New Zealand is not at all unlike the political landscape in the United States. So it's quite an interesting case. I might add that Jody Levin Epstein from CLASP has written a wonderful case study of the passage of the parental leave law in New Zealand, and I've also studied it. So paid family leave is a place, once again. Now, what does the absence of paid family leave do? Creates a lot of hardship for parents and children. I probably don't have to go into too much detail there, but it forces a lot of parents to choose between taking time off from work and losing their pay, impoverishing their families on the one hand, or the choice on the other hand to put their children in childcare essentially from birth. So it's a really, really problematic area. And let me just close with a few comments about childcare. Another area where the U.S. is really not very impressive, and the Anglophone countries are not either, I might add, especially what this graph is showing, and Professor Land also has a comparison on preschool, but I wouldn't want you to put the two next to each other. This is the provision of public preschool. I think your numbers, from what I can gather there, are rates of any kind of attendance in preschool. As we know in the U.S., a lot of preschool, essentially school, we're talking about for 3- and 4-year-olds, is private. This shows, the light blue bars is showing the percentage of children age 1 and 2 in publicly provided care. All the Anglophone countries are quite little. There's a lot of variation in Europe there. The darker blue bars are showing the percentage of children 3, 4, and 5 in publicly provided preschool. Now, the U.S. number is 53%, but that's very skewed towards 5-year-olds in kindergarten, of course, much of which is also part day. So the 3- and 4-year-olds in the U.S. are the children, frankly, that I'm terribly worried about, especially in terms of disparities, because kids in high-income families are in excellent preschool, and a lot of kids in low-income families, if not in Head Start, are not in, I would say, are not in adequate educational settings, and so Many of you, of course, know quite a bit about that. But the European model is moving towards universal preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds. It's in place in France and Belgium, to a large extent in Italy, growing rapidly across Europe. Despite certain social policy cuts in recent years, all of these programs for families and children have grown steadily since the 1980s. And the movement towards universal pre-K is a really big part of that story. So I think that, what does that mean? It means essentially the primary school starts at age 3, and increasingly at age 2.5. The French have moved to 2.5, or if the kid's out of nappies, whichever comes first. So there are lots of lessons to be learned as we look across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, and I would urge us to continue to do so.
Thank you, Janet. I'd like to invite Doug to come up.
Thank you, David. First of all, I just want to thank the Foundation's New America and the Foundation for Child Development for doing this work. I had the good fortune to work for the late Senator Moynihan for a few years, and one thing he told me a number of times was he thought that social problems that were not measured and reported on went unaddressed in our political process. And I think it's important to keep focusing attention on numbers and indicators for that sense. And I want to thank David in particular for inviting me here today. I'm here to talk more specifically about the UK, since I had the good fortune to go and study there. And I'm going to focus primarily on child poverty, which has already been discussed, often interacts with a lot of these other social issues. First of all, though, I have to provide a disclaimer. I do work on the Hill. This has nothing to do with any senator's point of view. This is just me. So don't blame Senator Reid or any other Democratic senator for a single thing I say today. So let's start by looking at the UK and the US. If you look in Ken's report, you find that the child poverty rate, as he defines it in the U.S., was 21.9% in 2000, whereas the UK was lower. It was 16.2%. This is by the definition used in the report, which is not actually the same definition the U.S. uses, which could complicate things. But it's a good measure. It's a widely used international measure. So that's what it was in 2000. Which is the most recent data I think that you could use for everything. For poverty, we do get more recent data. So if you look at, say, 2005, under our definition, we've gone from 16.1 to 17.6. The child poverty problem in the U.S. has gotten worse in recent years. Whereas in the UK, by one of the UK definitions, unlike the U.S. where we've had a standardized definition for decades, the UK has a sort of multiplicity of definitions. But by the one they focus on, it has declined from 32% to 27% over that period. So the 0.74 British number from 2000 is probably more like 0.6 or 0.5 by now. We've been getting worse. They've been getting better. So there's a bigger spread than there used to be. So the trend is clear. Now, what I think I was invited to talk about is the UK has actually made a national effort to reduce child poverty. Tony Blair declared in 1999 that they will be the first generation to end child poverty. This was a bold measure. I mean, people are probably familiar with Prime Minister Blair's record. He's often been out front on things. This was a bolt from the blue. They did not campaign on this. New Labour, when they were elected in 1997, did not say they were going to do this. And when I was in the UK, there was still a mystery as to where this idea came from. There wasn't even high-profile efforts to persuade Tony Blair to do this. He announced it. And people were quite excited. In fact, at one point, I talked to someone from what they would call a voluntary organization, a nonprofit, who said his organization had debated a year or two before whether they should call for an end to child poverty in Britain, decided it was too ambitious. Oh, we can't call for that. It's too unrealistic. And then the next year, Tony Blair said, let's do it. So this caused a lot of excitement. But one thing I think is important, in the U.S. when we've discussed child poverty, traditionally I come from a political world, the arguments are usually driven by moral authority. This is just wrong. It is inappropriate for a rich nation to have poor children. In the UK, this has often come up in the context of New Labour, which for American audiences often sounds like the New Democrats of the 1990s. They made arguments on behalf of morality, but it often was in the context of human capital. They wanted to reinvent government, and they wanted to prepare Britain to compete in the global economy. So if the knowledge economy is an aim, then work, skill, and above all, investing in children become essential aims, sorry for the typo, of welfare. So this is the same argument we see in the U.S. often used for school reforms, for education, for No Child Left Behind, or for the burgeoning pre-K movement. We need to compete. We need to invest in our children. In the UK, this translated into we need to end child poverty, which is a step beyond what we've seen in the U.S. One thing they've done in part of restoring the value of government or people's belief in government, in the UK they have, the New Labour government has many, many targets to be reached. They set targets for a lot of their policy goals. So this translated into a target. A generation turned out to be 20 years. So they had 20 years to do it. And now, of course, we've had a change in government in the UK. We have a new prime minister. So if this came from the top, presumably it would be open to review. Well, actually, the new prime minister, Gordon Brown, is perceived in the UK as to be even more committed to this than Tony Blair. Tony Blair has said relatively little about the child poverty goal since he announced it. Gordon Blair was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which in U.S. terms was Treasury Secretary and OMB Director, which is quite a powerful position. So he was seen as actually making speeches about it, driving forces, driving revenues to it, resources to it. So here's what he said a few years ago. I could read it, but it would take a while, but maybe you can read it. But the bottom line is it's the same sort of human capital argument. We need to invest in our children if we're going to compete. So it's the right thing to do for an intellectual reason. It's not just a moral thing. So there's a perception in the UK that, if anything, the new Prime Minister is more committed to this goal than the last Prime Minister who announced it. So what have they been doing? In the UK, this may sound familiar. They've been promoting work. As you saw in some of the data, they have issues with with not having enough people in employment. So they've put in a lot of effort into moving people off public benefits into work. They've also made work pay. The UK, fascinating to an American, had no minimum wage before Tony Blair took office. I got mocked a lot in the UK for our healthcare situation. They just didn't understand how we could be there. Well, I would often respond that we had managed to find a minimum wage some decades before they had. They've also used tax credits in a supplement work kind of way that would be familiar to Americans who know about the Earned Income Tax Credit. Again, this was not something they had before New Labour took over in the mid-'90s. They've also expanded childcare. That was not a priority under the previous governments, and as Janet could probably attest, the UK was very far behind continental Europe in childcare. They've also provided much more support for families and a child tax credit. Again, in the U.S. we have a child tax credit. In the UK they've expanded their they created a child tax credit and expanded it. They've also focused on early interventions, although this is not the sort of thing that will show up in your child poverty numbers in the short term. It's a long-term invention. They have a preschool program called Sure Start, which bears some resemblance to our Head Start programs, but it's not exactly the same thing. Again, this was a New Labour idea. And for those of you who are interested in preschool programs, it might be worth looking at because it's another effort in that area which might be translatable. As Janet was suggesting, I work in politics, suggesting that you look to Denmark or Sweden doesn't have a lot of political traction in our debates, but looking to the UK sometimes can. And the other benefit they've had is, you remember the recession we had in the early part of the decade? The UK never had that recession, so they've had a decade plus of steady growth. And if you're trying to reduce poverty, that's a very handy thing. One final comment, I guess I should say. They've talked mostly about promoting work, but if you look at what's actually moving the numbers, it's not what's moving the numbers. What the primary thing that has reduced child poverty in the UK is the child tax credit. And they don't discuss it that way because the child tax credit goes to everyone, whether you're working or not. And so they prefer politically to discuss measures to move people off of work and making work pay. But what's actually doing the heavy lifting is providing benefits to everyone. As shows up in Ken Land's report, worklessness, as they call it in the UK, is still a big problem over there. If you look at the data here, they have triple the number of parents who are not working. That's a pretty significant difference between us and the UK. But the political dialogue and actually the substantive dialogue there is much different. In the U.S., that translated into a lot of angst about welfare reform in the 90s. As they would call them in the UK, lone parents, single parents. Those people need to go to work, and you see the U.S. has a pretty high number of them now. The UK, there's a much different debate, and substantively, much of this issue is around disability benefits, what they would call incapacity benefits, people on long-term disability. And it's a very different political dialogue. I was in Scotland. And in Scotland, they thought this was all people who used to work in shipyards, and then Margaret Thatcher closed them in the 80s, and then some nice doctor decided they had a bad back, so they were on benefits. It was seen as an adjustment to a post-industrial economy to soften the blow. Much of the UK can resemble our Rust Belt, formerly industrial cities. And in substance, when you look into it, that's not actually all the people on the benefits. There are many women. There are many people from the helping professions. There are many stress-induced things. But the perception is that these are victims of the change in the economy. That's a much more sympathetic portrayal than we get in the U.S., where it's single parents in the inner city who need to go to work because they've been behaving badly. So it's been a little different political debate. How has the UK done? If we look at their definition, they went from 32% to 27%. But their first 5 years, they said, we're going to reduce child poverty by a quarter, and they didn't actually do it. And actually, last year, they lost a little bit of ground. There were more poor children in the UK. So they're going to need to do a lot more to make it to reducing child poverty by half by 2010, which is their goal. But if you look at it by a U.S. measure, they've actually done a lot more. I hesitate to do this. Relative and absolute poverty measures are kind of important, though, so this is a tricky thing here. The U.S. definition of poverty, as I think most people know, dates back to the 50s and 60s. It was a definition of absolute poverty, a bare minimum people needed to have to be able to get by, based on calculations by the late Molly Orshansky on how much food one needed and all these sorts of things. It's been updated for inflation ever since, so it's an absolute measure. If you have this amount, you're absolutely poor. If you have a little more, you're not poor. Virtually everybody else in the developed world defines poverty as a relative measure, as does the Foundation's report. Some version of median income. How far behind people in the middle are you? This is a different intellectual construct for poverty. If you're too far behind the middle, you are poor. It doesn't have anything to do with how much you actually have as a bare minimum to get by in some sort of third world sense. It brings up notions of inequality that Americans often don't like to discuss in our politics. If you look at the U.S. measure, if you apply an absolute standard, just take a measure from the mid-90s in the UK and inflate it, they've actually made tremendous progress from 28% to 15%. They might have cut child poverty in half, but they prefer a more ambitious way to define poverty and a more difficult task that they've set for themselves. This is particularly true because in a growing economy, as the UK has had for the last 10, 12 years, the median income is probably rising higher than inflation steadily. So what you need to get people out of poverty is floating higher. If you were actually in a bad economy, the median income wouldn't rise as much, and you would actually be able to achieve your target better, if this makes any sense. I think I may have just lost half the room. I'm sorry. But basically, the bottom line is, if the UK thought about poverty like us, they're still on track. If they think about poverty the way they do, they have a lot of work to do. So a few things we can thought of, a few lessons for us. They've actually been doing a lot of the things we used to do. It's not rocket science here to make work pay. That's a very familiar concept. It's not rocket science to try to promote work. We've done a lot of these things. In fact, a lot of what they've done was drawn from stuff we did here. They consciously looked at the earned income tax credit along with a few other models. They looked at our welfare reform along with a few other models. I can't tell you how many UK people I talked to who've been to Wisconsin. And I don't think they go there for any other reason. No offense against people from Wisconsin. And the other difference, though, is the UK has been much more focused, and they've had a consistent strategy, and they've stuck to it. Some of that is a difference in the political process, where in the UK, if you're in charge, you can pretty much do whatever you want every year, and here we have divided government, and we have 50 states, and it takes a lot longer to change things. If you look at what we did in the 1990s, by our definition, we actually probably did pretty well. You know, we have done a child poverty reduction that was pretty serious. Again, it was making work pay, expanding the EITC, expanding the minimum wage. A welfare reform that moved people off of public benefits into employment. And we had a strong economy that was very broad-based in its growth. So looking ahead, you know, we should probably be getting back to what was working. We've been losing ground for much of this decade. We know how to make incremental progress against child poverty if we want to. One thing that was interesting is whether human capital arguments that we've often been applying to education in preschool should be applied here as well. I think, as Janet alluded to, there is probably pretty good evidence that growing up in poverty hurts you in the long run. We could set a goal. People are starting to advocate for that, just like the British did. The Center for American Progress has a task force that did. Senator Edwards is out there campaigning on this. Setting a goal does have a benefit of focusing attention. It may be beneficial towards driving a debate. A key in the UK was better family support. Our child tax credit actually leaves out people at the bottom. The UK, they give those people more. There's maybe a reason why they're doing better against child poverty in recent years than we are. That would be a pretty easy change. And finally, common ground on family structure. As someone who's been through the political wars, a lot of child poverty issues in this country are arguments about single parents. And we've had great difficulty getting past certain ideological fights. You could reduce teen pregnancy if we could ever agree on what sex ed programs should be in high schools, but we haven't really been able to do that. You could also talk about ways to strengthen families, but so far there's been a conservative push to promote marriage very explicitly that many people have been uncomfortable with. There might be less confrontational ways to support families. There was evidence from welfare reform in Minnesota that financial support to families actually resulted in more couples staying together. That might be something that would be more broadly supported than more explicit programs that promote marriage. For the UK, they have to figure out if they're going to get more aggressive on benefits to work. They struggle with this disability program because if you've been defined as not able to work, is there a way that you could contemplate returning to work without suggesting you should never have been on benefits? It's a much more complicated policy situation than long-term benefits of other sorts. The part of being new labor is a resistance to aggressive redistribution that old labor would have done. Take from the rich, give to the poor, all of a sudden you have less child poverty. So far they've been very cautious about this, and they probably will remain so. Family structure. In the UK, the lone parent debate is much less loaded than it is here. They are much more sympathetic to the situation of single moms. In the U.S., we've been very aggressive in collecting child support from their partners of single parents. The U.K. has massively screwed this up. They've had computer system problems. It's not been a priority. We have deadbeat dads in the U.S. In the U.K., they have guys who are estranged fathers who dress up as superheroes to protest the fact that they can't see their kids. And they're sympathetic figures. It's been a very different debate. If they wanted to reduce child poverty, they should probably do better on child support. In urban regeneration, much like you see in here in Washington itself, a lot of the UK's former industrial towns have downtowns now that are quite attractive, but much of the neighborhoods around it still have a long ways to go. A final few points here that if we look across more countries, the UK has a lot of issues. This showed up in Dr. Land's report as far as Canada. We actually beat them. Woo, we were 20th out of 21 UNICEF countries. Primarily, these were European countries, so you saw a lot of the same things that Janet did. The UK may be making progress on poverty, but risky behaviors, it was off the charts. And having spent some time in the UK now, there's a culture of youth drinking that resembled the fraternities at my college. And so if you go to the central city in most UK places, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock on Saturday night, watch out. There's a lot of binge drinking going on. There's a lot of other risky behaviors, and this is what's dragging down part of their child well-being index when they're compared to other European countries and other. There's also a lot of, in the survey data, a lot of unhappiness in teenagers about their peers, where they ranked particularly low in having supportive relationships with any sort of friends. So with that, I'll leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. Adam.
Good morning. Thanks to all of you for sticking around, and thanks to my panelists, and for David and Justin for asking me to speak here. I'm going to round out this discussion by focusing on the U.S. and actually, if we believe, Kenneth Land's been very helpful in identifying all these different indicators and where the U.S. ranks on that. And you would think that one of the solutions would be, well, some government intervention, more spending in some sense. So I'm going to be looking at the federal role in spending and to what degree federal spending links to effectiveness in improving child well-being. So I want to focus on some research that I've done with some colleagues of mine at the Urban Institute, Gene Stirley and Jillian Reynolds. And this is from a paper called Kids Share 2007. And what this paper did is it looked at federal spending on children from 1960 through 2006, and then it actually projected out through 2017. And importantly, in this paper, we considered not just direct outlays, but also tax expenditures. So the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and so on, to get a total idea of spending on children over time. And also, it's important to note, obviously, that more dollars spent doesn't necessarily translate into more effective programs or improved child well-being. But one hopes that there's some correlation over time. Otherwise, it really requires us to look very hard at the way we are spending our resources on children to see if there's not more effective things we can do. This first chart gives you a sense of the composition of spending on children in 1960. And it's interesting to note, we don't think of this usually, but the biggest program that went to children about 45 years ago was actually the dependent exemptions. That's that personal exemption you claim for your child on tax day. So that was by far the largest program going to children. And next you had survivors benefits under Social Security. Those are for children who had lost a parent. AFDC, which we all are pretty familiar with, Impact Aid, some of the child nutrition programs, and a few other veterans' disability and retirement. But again, so much of the spending of children back then was either through the tax code or it was through survivors programs and the major social insurance programs that we had back then. Fast forward to today, the landscape has changed drastically. While the tax code is still the preferred measure, the preferred way of getting resources to children, if you see the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, many other in-kind programs have become more popular over time, especially some of the health and nutrition programs like Medicaid and you have Section 8 housing, you have food stamps, and so on. So there's been this real shift over time from providing just cash subsidies through the tax code to also providing a lot of in-kind benefits. So if we look at the trend, we look at totals over time, what we see, the most noticeable feature about this is that in 1960 we still had a very, very large defense budget. And as that went down over time, it freed up a lot of budget territory for domestic spending to increase. So these were the days of Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, who was actually very much a liberal as far as federal spending went. So in place of declining defense budgets, you had the rise of all these other domestic spending priorities. But mainly, what we don't see, the bottom line. This is spending on children. All these figures are as a fraction of GDP. What we don't see is a noticeable increase, really, in the federal resources that went to children. What we do see is an incredible leap in the amount of resources that go to the non-child components of the major social insurance programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So that's important to note. And also, I don't really tout the case here for how well spending lines up with child well-being, but if we do recall Kenneth's opening graph where he showed you this child well-being index over time in the U.S., and if we noticed, it bottomed out in the early 90s. And maybe this is predictive, but we can see that spending on children began to bottom out as a fraction of the economy in the mid-'80s. So maybe there is something causal here. This is definitely something that more research ought to be directed to. So we had our own indicators. So we identified 8 broad areas of spending on children over time. So tax subsidies. Again, this is the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. Income security, which includes TANF, supplementary security income. Health, which is like Medicaid, SCHIP, education. We have nutrition programs like school lunch, housing, social service programs, which includes, let's say, child welfare, and training, which would be programs like summer youth employment. And what we found here is again, over time, there was, from 1960 to 2006, there was a big shift in the amount of money, in the composition of federal spending on children that was delivered just through the tax code, and that was cash. So we see tax programs, those decline dramatically as a share of GDP, as does income security. But in its place, we spend a lot more on health, a lot more on education, nutrition, housing, and social services. So this is important to bear in mind, that really our government felt that over time what was really needed for children was less in the way of cash supplements relatively, and much more in the way of in-kind benefits. And again, if we think of everything in terms of just domestic spending. So we're leaving out defense. We see that so much more is being devoted to programs that go to seniors over time, whereas actually the share going to children has been on the decline. I mean, it bottomed out in about mid-'80s and has since been increasing a little. But the children's share of, let's say, the domestic pie declined from about 20% in 1960 to 15% in 2005, whereas there's been this incredible increase in the amount of money going to seniors. So what have been the impacts then on poverty? Well, we spend about $4,000 per capita per child in this country, and we have a child poverty rate of about 13%. I'll explain in a minute why my measure differs from Doug's. Elderly per capita, we spend nearly $20,000, and we have an elderly poverty rate of about 6.8%. Now, this measure of poverty is for 2004, and it uses an more experimental measure that also includes some of the cash transfers. So it's post cash transfers. So it's in some ways it's a more accurate vision of how much actually gets spent on kids and the elderly. But still, so we're spending about 5 times more on elderly, and they have about half the poverty rate compared to children. There are about 3 points to make on poverty. I mean, first, most poverty rates anywhere are usually a measure before government transfers. So what is always useful, and if you have the data to do it, is to look at a measure post-transfer, if at all possible, just to get a sense of what countries do, through their social safety nets to equalize the treatment of these different vulnerable groups. And a second, poverty rates, by definition, they ignore expenditures on education, health, nutrition, and housing. So it's important to note that if our single goal in this country were to eradicate child poverty, you could wind up spending a lot less on health, education, all these other in-kind benefits, and provide more in cash supplements to children. But clearly, their well-being would not be better off. So it's not just. Sometimes I think the focus is too much on one thing, and also you don't necessarily want lawmakers to take this, to listen too much to this priority, because then they may see that in a world where there is a very fixed pot of money to spend, that they're going to say, well, we're going to reshuffle some of the monies currently available for children, take out from health, take out from housing, and maybe put toward income, and then suddenly we have this much better measure. Oh, look, we've reduced child poverty, but really without making anyone better off. Future trends. So this next section just shows how, if current policies are extended, and a lot of these data we take from the Congressional Budget Office, what is the future of children's spending relative to other priorities? And what we see is that there's this increasing orientation to the end of the life cycle, that there's much more spending on the elderly relative to children. And we also see that there's an increasing orientation toward consumption. So again, we're supporting a lot of people to spend about a third of their lives retired, whereas we're not making investments, the necessary investments in children and other groups. So basically, children's programs will get squeezed between rising retirement and health expenditures and limited revenues. And more importantly, there's also an issue of growth, of the inherent growth built into programs that go towards senior citizens and programs that go to children. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those portions that go to senior citizens, they have high growth each year. It's automatic, and it's per beneficiary. So we're not spending more on these groups just because the population is aging. We're actually spending much more per beneficiary over time, and the growth is automatic. It's outside of the normal appropriations process each year. Whereas most programs that go to children, even the so-called mandatory programs, don't have any automatic. If they grow at all, it's with inflation. Whereas Social Security and other programs, they tend to grow with wages or with healthcare prices, which grow even faster than the economy. So that's important to know that over time, the amount of resources that goes to those 60, 65 and over, they can only help but increase faster than the economy, whereas resources devoted to children, as currently constructed, can really only go down. So what this shows, what we project sort of by category, what will happen between now and 2017. And so the amount of money that's available to kids through the tax code, these, again, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, that's slated to go down, as is income security. And health is really the only program that goes up, and this is really thanks to the portion of Medicaid that goes to children. That's really, it's that single program that's driving the result for children in health. Education will go down, nutrition will go down, housing and social services. This is what's projected. This is not to say that this is what actually will happen. I think thankfully, there are too many child advocates in this country to allow this to happen, so that this will force some realignments of policy. But it's just important to know this is where current policies will take us. But there is a looming problem on the horizon. If you take just spending in 6 areas, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, international, and interest on the debt, if current policies are continued and the tax cuts are made permanent, these 6 areas of spending will consume all available revenues by about 2019. Now, the year sort of bounces back and forth each time you look at the projections, but it's within the next 10 to 15 years. So what that means is that everything else, all spending on children, spending on roads and highways, I mean, even the money that would come to pay the electric bills in the White House would have to come out of deficit spending at that point. So we face, and this is probably very similar in other industrialized countries, that the weight of these commitments to our older population groups is pretty much sucking all the budgetary resources that are available to go to other groups, particularly children. So conclusions we can make is that the U.S. budget is in a unique situation. Never before in our history has so much of future revenues been claimed in advance by particular senior-oriented programs. And meanwhile, U.S. children are sort of left to fight for the leftovers in a budget that seems scheduled not to really have any leftovers. I mean, finally, though, it's not clear that the federal spending that we do devote to children is entirely effective. It seems like we can spend more on health, but with little benefits. You don't necessarily see the benefit in a decreasing child mortality rate or in better health outcomes. So it's a question of even the resources that we have involved. It's a question of how effectively they're being used. And last, I wanted to make a couple comments on Dr. Land's index. I thought this was an excellent, really an excellent endeavor. The only things I would suggest adding would be to include rates of child abuse, neglect, or maltreatment. Although these data are notoriously difficult to collect and standardize across countries, so I can understand why he hasn't included them to date. Also, data on incarceration, crime rates, and juvenile justice expenditures, if those are available, and also some indicator that tallies the resources available for social services, for government interventions for children who are at risk. Finally, this last, you can't really see it, but this is from UNICEF. So they actually have produced some tables on child maltreatment, and the U.S. ranks, can't see, but very near the bottom. This measures the number of children out of 1,000 who die each year due to maltreatment. So in the U.S. it's about roughly 3. With Mexico and Portugal rounding it out. And the other Anglophone countries are, well, I think New Zealand is right. New Zealand's right behind the USA, but then the UK seems to have the least incidence of child maltreatment deaths each year. So these data are available. They may not be. I'll leave it to Dr. Land to decide how useful and credible they are. And that's it. Thank you.
I'd like you to join me. Yes. Thanking all 3 of the respondents as well as Dr. Land for excellent presentations. I thought they complemented themselves very well and really provided a lot of grist here for my thinking, and I hope yours as well. I'd like to do 2 things now. First, I'd like to, as we open it up now for Q&A, invite Dr. Land to join the panel. Secondly, I have a question for each of the panelists briefly as Ken is coming up here. First to Janet, I was curious for her either to say more about the interplay between supporting parents and supporting children, or her opinion on India and China, how we think about them as competitors, people working really, really hard. How do they fit into this whole mix potentially. Secondly, to Doug, I wanted to think of either or. You can pick. Secondly, to Doug, I wanted him to say more about the child tax credit if he could. He seemed to say that was carrying a lot of the weight about having success in Britain, and what either about their debate or the numbers they're using or how much they're affording parents and families for their child tax credit is something that we should be considering here, for him to say more about the child tax credit in Britain. And finally, to Adam, I was thinking a little bit about the transfer away from the income support and tax expenditures towards the other in-kind benefits. If he had a suggestion about trying to write that balance a little bit, if there was one kind of income support or tax expenditure piece in the whole plethora of minimum wages and ITCs and child tax credits and other dependent care items that we should be focusing on, what would he have a thought about what he would lift up for the community? So we've got the mics here. If you could briefly answer those, and we're going to open it up.
The first question you asked was to ask me to explain what I meant when I said, where did you go? Over there. About parental well-being and child well-being. I really have a very particular point. There's much to say on this, but I think one thing that I'm really very troubled by in the United States is what has really become I realize I'm cringing here. The issue of the mommy wars is a really difficult issue in the U.S. The debate about maternal employment, is it good for kids, is it bad for kids, is it good for families? It's a very, very old discussion, and one that I think is often not very carefully phrased. But I think the point is, in other words, a lot of the debates in the U.S. Suggest that there's a trade-off between maternal employment on the one hand and kids' well-being on the other hand, that either mothers go to work or they stay home and take care of their kids, and if they do the latter, it's good for children. This debate has been coming and going for a long time. My point is simply that I really think that's a false trade-off, and one that's been very damaging in the United States, and it's been damaging politically because it's divided child well-being advocates and feminists in a way that has just really broken up the constituencies for these work-family reconciliation programs. So what we argued in our book was, again, it's a false trade-off, and one that's, I think, embedded in also a really minimalist social policy system. What a lot of the European systems are doing in these so-called work-family reconciliation policies are trying to figure out ways that families can flourish, that children can have time with their parents, that there can be gender equality in the labor market. And that includes some efforts that relax men's attachment to the labor market through opportunities for high-quality part-time work, through paid parental leave for fathers, through limits on the annual work year and work week. So what you get in some of these other systems are systems where there's, much higher levels of gender equality at home and at work. That's only one measure of parental well-being, but it's a crucial one, where parental time, for their own activities and for kids is greater, and where kids have more time with their parents and are doing well. So I think that's really my argument. It has to do with gender equality, parental time, and child well-being. So again, I think there are many, many models. And we also say, I just might add, this is not a discussion that's active in the U.S., but it is in Europe. A lot of countries are struggling with very low birth rates, which some of you may know, especially Eastern, Southern Europe, and Asia. The countries in Europe that have the very generous work-family reconciliation policies, the really strong cases are the 4 Nordic countries, France and Belgium. They have the highest maternal employment rates in Europe and the highest birth rates. So that is, I think, really crucial. People are not choosing between childbearing and employment. They're not choosing between they're not poor and their kids are doing well. And social policy is a huge part of the story, including a lot of the UK model programs and so forth. India and China, I think I might just punt.
You don't have to answer them both. Just in the interest of time, I'll just take the one. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll let someone else discuss India and China.
Okay, Doug.
Second most common question I'm getting these days, by the way.
Doug. I'd love to hear the
They have really good Indian food in the UK, but the child tax credit in the UK operates quite differently because of philosophical differences. The New Labour approach to social policy often draws upon what they would call progressive universalism, which is very long term. But it means, in essence, giving something to the middle and then giving more to the people at the bottom to build, in part, political support for whatever you're doing. Our tax policy in recent years has actually been a little bit reversed. Where we give something to people in the middle and a lot more to people at the top, which gets into conservative beliefs about how the economy grows. In the UK, if we wanted to imitate the UK in the child tax credit and give more to people at the bottom, first of all, we'd have to start giving something to people at the bottom. Our child tax credit cuts off at a low income level, where people who have very low incomes get nothing at all. you would have to have a debate about uses of the tax code. There's a lot of conservative resistance to using the tax code for this sort of benefit where people aren't working much. Partly it's social engineering to conservatives, but also you see this in the earned income tax credit debate, where if you're giving taxes to people who aren't paying taxes, in essence. In the UK, this has come up now and then, but it hasn't been nearly the ideological debate that you've seen. What the conservatives in the UK have argued, at least in recent years, and this may be because of the political support the child tax credit has among middle-income families in the UK, they've argued more about bad implementation. In the UK, the tax credits come out more regularly. Here, we're used to the earned income tax credit being this annual thing. Same with the child tax credit. They've tried to provide it on a more monthly basis, which raises challenges in administration that they've often struggled with, particularly with incomes that go up and down, where people get overpaid or underpaid and they have to reclaim it. And the conservatives in the UK have focused more on problems of implementation than ideological criticism of using the tax code to help people at the bottom who aren't paying taxes.
Thank you, Doug.
There's an important philosophical distinction between the U.S. and Europe that's important to understand. In this country, the thing that we fear the most is it's not poverty, it's unemployment. So there's a reason why we don't have a bigger welfare system or a welfare system that's comparable to what you see in Europe, because there's been this age-old belief that a larger welfare system reduces the incentive to work, and so you'll have a lot more people on the public dole and a lot higher unemployment. And we feel that from values that it's not the values that represent us, and also that it hurts the economy in the long run. So there's a reason why that sort of like our biggest increases, our biggest gains from the standpoint of welfare and from the standpoint of, say, cash transfers have been not through AFDC or TANF, but through the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, because these are programs that ostensibly reward work. And they have been credited with raising a lot of families out of poverty over the 1990s and recently this century as well. So if you were going to find a way to provide more cash to families, to low-income families with kids, you probably have to do it through an expansion of the EITC and the child tax credit. As currently designed, the reason that the child tax credit doesn't provide any benefits for those making below, say, really $12,000 a year is it was meant to sort of backfill the EITC. If you're familiar with the EITC, it phases in very generously up to a plateau that you reach around 11,000 or so, and then it holds steady, and then it phases out very steeply. So it begins to almost penalize anyone who wants to improve their economic well-being beyond, let's say in the mid-teens, 15,000 and higher, begins to lose about 20 cents on the dollar. So the child credit in its current form was meaning to phase in, while the earned income tax credit was phasing out. So it would give basically families, in combination, it would give families an even benefit. So if you wanted to sort of rationalize all these credits and make something more generous, that can be done. There are proposals to do it. In fact, the President's Tax Reform Panel came up with a pretty nifty credit. They call it, I think they just call it their family credit. They make it much easier to claim, and it's more generous. But I think these wind up being very expensive endeavors. So you have to be willing, you have to convince Congress to put in another 40, 50, 60 billion easily to do this. I mean, I agree, I think this is what it takes, but it's not one of those things where you can just do some tinkering around the edges and suddenly you have much more income coming to those children. And again, because all these benefits, these tax benefits, they phase in based on earnings, you still aren't addressing those families that have a marginal attachment to the workforce. So you still aren't going to help. You're going to be winding up helping people you've already helped in the past. You're going to help them more, but you're not going to help people at the very bottom. And the only way to do that is you would really have to get the American public to accept a program that they've been very reluctant to accept in the past.
Great. Thanks. All right. Oh, raise your hand if you've got a question. Let's see how many questions there are. Okay, good. All right, we're going to take these three questions in order. Go boom, 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 and then we're going to let the panelists answer them. Just in the interest of time, we're going to take groups of three questions. So, lady, raise your hand over here. Yes. Oh, you got one too.
I'm Ariane Higwish, Institute for Women's Policy Research. coming back to something that Doug mentioned, that much of the social policy debate in Europe and in the UK is driven by macroeconomic arguments, saying we need to compete with India and China, and hence we need to develop the workforce. That goes for work family policy, that goes for child development, for childcare. What strikes me in the US is that this is so absent here, given that the same workforce development issues presumably hold. The demographic issues aren't quite as strong, but skill shortages and so on are. Why is this absent, or is this trend shifting slowly?
Great. Okay, let's hold that. This is a question in the middle. Did someone have a question in the middle? Yeah, go ahead. Say your question briefly.
Yeah, Harvey Sloan, Racial Education Program. It is puzzling to me that when we talk about child well-being, so little is said about the very significant age of 0 to 3, either conception to 3, 4, 5. I mean, there's a little bit about parents and helping them, and there's a little bit about child abuse. But holy Christmas, this is when this brain is developing and any kind of positive stimulation and nurturing. And it's not rocket science, but we really don't talk about it.
Great. There's a question over here. Did I see a hand?
Simplistic rendering of what the different panelists have talked about and what the indicators might be taken to mean, and it's quite simplistic, is that we are a nation with relatively low public supports and protections for families. Families are working hard, teens are working hard, kids are doing reasonably well in school completion and drinking, and then outcomes are doing badly. We have academic scores and health, at least physical health, and how mental health fit in. But I was wondering if the panel might respond to that simplistic view. How well does it hold up? Fewer inputs, families working hard, but kids doing it.
Great. Thank you for those questions. I'll turn it over to the panel to answer any one. Who wants to jump in first?
I guess I should briefly at least address the first one, since it sounded like it was partly my fault. I think in the U.S. the globalization, what do we do about India and China debate, so far has been mostly driven into our educational reform discussions. I think in the states you're starting to see it in the pre-K discussions. A lot of states are implementing pre-K type programs, in part because of business leader support. I think at the national level, aside from a tradition where this hasn't been a big issue, so much of our political debate right now has been driven by national security that there's a lot of anxiety about globalization that hasn't really made it into our main political dialogue. I work in the Senate, and we spend 2 weeks every month debating Iraq. And that squeezes out a tremendous amount of other political discussion. But we may see that change over the course of the presidential campaign. Anybody else?
Actually, I just want to say two different things that are touching on both of these. I want to address my first comment, I think, to Adam, if I might. I don't think there's any trade-off, actually, between the programs we're discussing today and unemployment. There's a very large literature and an enormous debate about this. I guess I would just say that I'm not sure if you're noting a perception or a perception that you think is a correct one, but there's an enormous amount of research on this. These kinds of programs that we're talking about, services for kids, child care, paid family leave, even shortening the working week, increasing rights to flexibility, part-time options, I don't think there's any literature that suggests that these cause unemployment. In the countries that I've been pointing to as the high providers, 4 of the 5 of them have unemployment rates that are lower than the U.S. These programs have grown as unemployment has fallen in Europe. There certainly are policy mechanisms that add to unemployment, but I don't think it's these, and I don't think it's social spending. It's measures that make labor markets rigid. So there's much to talk about there, but I guess maybe you might want to come back to that. I think it relates to some extent to Ariane's question. These programs are perfectly compatible with highly productive economies and with macroeconomic outcomes that are successful. In terms of your comment in the back, I guess I would simply say, if I understood you right, we need to think about the balance between public and private inputs. You know, in these Anglophone countries, the state sector is smaller. We've privatized child caregiving to a large extent in this country. Many sort of view children, I think, as consumer goods, as the private property of their families. We have a huge amount of private input into children. Even the things that I study, I mean, there's an enormous consumer market for child care. paid family leave and workplace benefits are available through labor markets for parents. But the levels of provision at the average are, in fact, much lower than in the countries with large public systems, and the distribution is extraordinarily regressive. Low-skilled workers in low-income households have very little, pay more for childcare, have very few workplace benefits. Highly skilled, more high-income households have access to huge amounts of these benefits through the workplace. So I think you need to think not just about the level of input, is it public or private, and the distribution. The public systems level, they have an enormous equity impact,
I guess that's what
and that's really important to add.
Input.
The public input is
Low
absolutely
public
less in the
inputs,
Anglophone countries.
high family input, then it's not working.
All of these, I mean, there's spending on kids, no matter how you measure it, is less in the Anglophone countries than in most of the European countries. Now, it's also true that spending per kid in Europe is high, partly because the birth rates are fairly low. But as a share of GDP, there's no question the public inputs are lower across all the Anglophone countries.
Ken?
Let me follow up on that as well. I think your characterization, your rough characterization, is pretty much on target. What our indicator study shows is that indeed America's children and youth do better on those outcomes that are family-oriented, where families can have an influence, and local communities, civil society, private sector, including schools, civic organizations, religious institutions, and so forth. The outcomes where we do less well are the publicly funded ones. But kids are getting their college degrees at a higher rate. They're getting high school diplomas at a higher rate. They're better connected to social and economic institutions than the other countries are, at least by these indicators. So in certain outcomes, we do pretty good, but in others, we do poorly.
Yeah, what I was referring to is an anti-poverty program that would something like what was conceived around the guaranteed annual incomes, the proposals of the late 60s and early 70s, something that would pay you close to what was then the minimum wage if you didn't have a job. And programs of that magnitude they would solve poverty, but they have pronounced work disincentives. And you do see this in, not so much the Anglophone countries, but you do see this in the north, some of the northern European countries. You see this in Germany, that they had such a generous welfare system that that many people, they would get more from the public dole than they would get if they, let's say, they took a job as a cleaning person in a hotel. In fact, they would call anything that paid below what they would get out of these welfare programs, they would refer to them as hunger wages. Like, why should I do that? I'd have to A, work, and B, I'd get less money for it. So in the U.S., there's never been anything close to that. I mean, while the work disincentive effects of AFDC and TANF have been well documented, these have always been very small programs. So it's never very much bared on the national unemployment picture. But there is a very pronounced fear here that, if you were to create such a program, everyone would, it would make all the lazy people come out of the woodwork, and unemployment would shoot up and productivity would go down. Whether that's realistic or not, it's hard to say because it's never been tested out here.
Great. All right, as we finish up here, I'm going to say three very brief questions, then we're going to finish. There was a lady in the check, you had one, and then the two questions in the back, if you wouldn't mind. We'll hold yours till afterwards in the interest of time. So 1, 2, 3, and Bill, and we'll let the panelists wrap up, and then we're going to finish because I know we're running time. So, lady.
My name is Sally Shake, Education Legislative Services, and I have a question about data. You discussed the history of the definition of poverty, the difference between absolute poverty and relative poverty. What I'm wondering, as the Census Bureau is considering use of the American Community Survey data and is in some years uses the decennial census data and then switches to census residuals and puts together different packages to define child poverty, how do we know all of that is getting at what we need to be getting at, particularly for federal funding purposes for any of these programs?
Okay, the second question, Lynn.
Sure. Two quick things. My name is Liz Kamiak with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. I just wanted to a little localize the plug for Objectives Research. DC is considering a bill to get 10 paid sick days to all employees. So if you live in the District of Columbia or work in the District of Columbia, that's something to check out. And then the other thing is, I guess I'm sort of heartened in some way by Adam's really gloom and doom chart on spending on the elderly, because it seems like medical costs are a large part of that chunk. And if, we've got the American public who wants healthcare reform, and maybe if we got some healthcare reform, it would free up some money for other priorities and for the children and the elderly. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit, if you have seen any research on controlling spending in medical programs like Medicare could actually free up some of that money.
Great.
Hi, I'm Bill O'Hare from the Kids program with the Casey Foundation. I'm going to phrase this question in respect to a particular event, but feel free to interpret a little more broadly. But when the OECD study that Doug mentioned was released in February, it showed the United States 20th out of 21. We've got very little coverage in this country, a few stories in the papers, not front page. In contrast to Great Britain, where it was front page story, Tony Blair commented, they called for a summit. And I'm baffled as to why Americans are not more outraged by how poorly we do compared to other developed countries. And I guess I'd like the thoughts of the panelists to why aren't we outraged? And secondly, what could advocates do to make us more outraged?
Great. Thank you, Bill. All right. So first the question, who wants to handle the statistical question? Any thoughts?
Not me.
You want to do the poverty one?
I guess I would just say about poverty, I say this wearing my hat with the Luxembourg Income Study. This is a lot of what we do. I think that the important thing to note if you're comparing child poverty over time or across countries is not so much the variation by survey, but to make sure you're using the exact same measure. I mean, that may sound obvious, but what is it? The U.S. or Shansky includes, it's net of cash transfers, doesn't include non-cash, it does not include taxes, etc. The line is drawn in a particular way, inflated by the CPI. I think you could find fairly similar results across surveys. That a lot of the bigger variation comes in the methods. If you switch to these relative poverty, actually the relative poverty numbers that Dr. Lamb presented and I presented, those are Luxembourg Income Study data numbers, except for New Zealand. It's just it happens to be a totally different measure. 50% of the median adjusted for household size. That includes cash and non-cash. It's net of taxes. So the most important thing is just, I would say, to make sure you construct the measure the same way. That would be more crucial, I think, than actually shifting surveys. I don't know if anyone wants
Mr. Gloom and Doom, any thoughts?
to disagree with that.
If that slide roused any enthusiasm in you, I have to come up with more convincing charts then. No, I mean what it does point out is that if we continue current policies, we really are going to go off a cliff. And so the idea is that if you look at this, this is going to force lawmakers to they're going to have to revisit these major programs because there's simply going to be such a huge gap between the revenue we take in and the amount of money we have to spend to finance these programs that it's going to force a realignment. With respect to how can we make these programs better, actually to make a plug for New America, Len Nichols, who's the director of our health policy program, is very, very shortly coming out with a paper on universal health care. And one of his big arguments is that so much of the money we spend is these are on very expensive treatments that have that have little statistical merit behind them in terms of improving people's health, and that if you spent money on what was proven to work, you could eke out tremendous savings, and these savings could then be spent to ensure a lot of families with kids that don't have insurance now. So that's something that will be coming out, I believe, this week. But yeah, it's going to force, I think, it's going to force lawmakers to look at how effective these enormous hundreds of billions of dollars we spend now, how they could be better spent in the future.
Great, thank you. Doug or Ken, do you have any thoughts on Bill's question about what we do first?
No, go ahead. I think that part of what happened in the UK is that in the UK they're used to comparing themselves with Europe as part of the EU. There's league tables and all that sort of stuff. The US norm comparison is actually your work with the kids count. How am I doing against Mississippi? How am I doing against Washington? How am I doing against Missouri? There's also a great reluctance to look at European model because there's an assumption that everybody is Sweden and pays insane taxes, and we can never do that, so we should never bother comparing ourselves to them. As a micro point, the fact that the British government has put out a child poverty goal makes it an issue when there's a study saying they're not doing well on child well-being. They're asserting that it's amenable to government effort. In this country, we often assume that it's like the weather. Oh, well, the economy's bad, more poor people, that's it, as opposed to something the government can do something about. And finally, I think it gets back to a question of who are the people they think are at risk. In this country, we're very divided by race or ethnicity or region. There's often an assumption, I think, in the middle class that when you see these reports, it's not my kids, except for schools, in which case we freak out. But if it's child abuse, or if it's oh, that's the kids in Anacostia, it doesn't have anything to do with me, because we're much more divided than some of the European countries might perceive themselves as being.
And the last word for Ken, Dr. Lane.
Sorry. I think that when we started the study last summer, we didn't know about the OECD publication that would be released in February. I must say that imitation is the subtlest form of flattery, and while there is no explicit citation to the CWI work in the report, there's a vague reference to a study that's been going on for 30 years. Actually, it's been going on only a few years, although we date back 30 years. But in any case, much of the frame of the OECD report builds upon the work we've done. When we focused on this study, our advice from David and others was that we should do Anglophone countries for the reasons that Doug just mentioned. And so that's the focus of this report. Hopefully, this contrast among the 5 Anglophone countries will focus attention somewhat more.
Great. I want to thank all of our speakers, and I want to thank you all for coming. We hope you join us for our next fall event. In the interest of the fact that we have a next event that's going to come right on the heels of this, if we could continue any conversations in the hall, it would really help our ability to get ready for the next event. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day. Oh, thank you so much. I really want to follow up with you.